Natasha Hausdorff is a barrister at Six Pump Court. She's a director of the non-governmental organisation UK Lawyers for Israel. She speaks frequently on international law, foreign affairs and national security policy. She holds law degrees from Oxford and Tel Aviv universities. She was a fellow in the National Security Law Programme at Columbia Law School, and she previously clerked for the President of the Israeli Supreme Court in Jerusalem, Chief Justice Miriam Nail. Natasha, good evening.
Good
now,
evening.
I'm going to ask you some questions. We've got about 25 minutes. Is there anything, this is about the vision for peace, or the plan for annexation, or the taking over the occupied territories, or whichever phrase you wish to use. Could I ask first, and this is, I'm putting my sort of questions to one side, I'll come back to them. What is the strict legal position in relation to those countries, so that land between what is the green line, and I will make no apology for saying the green line is that line which is the ceasefire line, which was agreed after the end of the Israeli War of Independence in 1949. So as the ambassador previously referred to, when there was a vote in favor of there being two states, an Arab state and a Jewish state, those countries around Israel were determined to stop Israel being created, and abandoned effectively the idea of there being an Arab state. There was then a war. Israel declared independence, and at the end of that war in 1949 there was a ceasefire line. It's not a border. When people talk, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Natasha, when people talk about 67 borders, there are none in the context of what is now, what people call, what used to call the West Bank, some people call Sharon or Judea and Samaria. So what's the specific legal status of that land?
Robert, you're absolutely right. When people refer to the 1967 borders, they're referring to an armistice line, which is neither a border nor does it date from 1967, but from 1948. It's been subject to numerous ceasefire agreements between Israel and its neighbours, which were explicit that these lines did not constitute borders. But this issue is like so many others in the context of this topic. It takes us really right to the heart of the issue, that there is a disconnect between the rhetoric and the reality of the situation. And that disconnect stretches to the legal analysis and the legal status, also a disconnect between the legal, let's say the rhetoric on international law and the reality of international law. And this is where we see misconceptions developing and misleading terms being used. Now, I'm going to be tough with you, given your stance earlier with the ambassador. And I have to say, I echo all of the sentiments that Joy expressed. We're very sad to see him go, and he has had a fantastic tenure as ambassador here in London. I appreciate that the term annexation has now developed, and it's been adopted really seemingly as the shorthand for the proposal slated for discussion next month. But it's not what Israel is considering in legal terms, which is really the proposal to apply Israeli civilian law in parts of Area C in the West Bank. Now, annexation is about taking for yourself territory which belongs to another state. So the key examples that are usually given, it's what Crimea did in 2014, it's what Russia did with Crimea in 2014. Another famous example is Germany annexing Austria in 1938. And in fact, it's what Jordan tried to do with the West Bank between 1948 and 1967 for the period that it occupied it. What is being considered by Israel is a change to the internal administration of the area, specifically in parts of the West Bank. It does not involve another state's territory. It is not annexation. And before we can have any sensible conversation about the pros and the cons of it, or a debate about whether it's a good idea or not, it's important that we're absolutely clear about that. Likewise, we need to be clear about the fact that it's not illegal for Israel to carry out this proposal, contrary to what seems to have become the received wisdom. Since its independence in 1948, the only state that can be described as sovereign in that territory is Israel, and it's universal, fundamental, customary international law that tells us that. Now, if for some reason the international community is making an exception with regard to Israel and treating it as a different case, now that is a double standard, and that is a true violation of international law, that out of all of the countries in the world, they choose to treat Israel differently. There is a fundamental principle of public international law that establishes the borders of newly emerging states at the moment of independence. And I hope you'll bear with me when I try and set out as succinctly as possible the key part of international law that tells us the answer.
I'd like you to, so if you just hold that thought,
Sure.
It feeds into a question from Karen and Irene. I think we had a question from them before. And what they talk about is the British Prime Minister referring to Israel's proposed extension of civilian law as either being an annexation, which you've already covered, or the illegal occupation of land. So if you could just explain whether that's right or not, and if it's not, what the actual proper description should be.
So the reason that both of those descriptions are wholly incorrect is the application of this fundamental principle of customary international law, which is universally applied to the emergence of new states at independence when they are emerging from a pre-existing administrative unit. Let me break that down. The history of this is that it was developed in the 19th century in South America. It was subsequently applied also to the decolonization in Africa and Asia, and to the disintegration of the former communist federations. It's been applied to all states emerging in these contexts as a default rule. It's also been applied to states emerging from mandates. So when the mandate for Mesopotamia became the Kingdom of Iraq, likewise with the mandates for Syria and Lebanon. And this universal rule for determining the borders of states at independence dictates that a new state takes on the boundaries of the pre-existing administrative unit as its international borders. The rule is called uti possidetis juris. I'd encourage everyone that's still on to look it up, to Google it, and see how it's defined, what it dictates, and how it's been universally applied in these contexts.
Just for those of us who don't juggle with those terms on a daily basis, just say that again. The principle is?
Uti possidetis juris.
And that means?
Well, the direct translation is as you possess, so shall you possess. But what it means, and the way that it's developed as a customary principle, which has been recognized by the International Court of Justice, is that when a state emerges, as Israel did in 1948, from a pre-existing administrative entity, which in this case was the British Mandate, it inherits the borders of that pre-existing administrative entity. And in Israel's case, we're talking about the eastern side of the British Mandate that divided that administrative unit from the separate administrative unit of Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. And that is the line that goes all the way down the Jordan River to the south. It means that East Jerusalem, the West Bank, form part of Israeli sovereign territory in 1948. Now, that is not to say that it is the policy of the Israeli government that this must always remain Israeli sovereign territory. On the contrary, over the decades, successive governments have shown themselves willing to negotiate over the territory, and some governments have sought to create a Palestinian state there, or a Palestinian autonomy. But what's key is that this principle tells us what the starting point is. And the starting point is fundamentally important because it reveals this claim, this allegation that Israel is violating international law by considering these proposals, or even by its very presence there, to be incorrect. It puts the lie to the term occupation. Now, that is another term that has taken on a life of its own as a political term. It's deployed for purposes by Israel's opponents in this context and in this discussion. But the framework of the law of occupation applies where a sovereign has been ousted from their territory. So once again, even if you set aside the fundamental notion and the application of uti possidetis juris in this case, and you ignore Israel's sovereign claims over this territory. The absence of any other sovereign means that the framework of occupation, legally speaking, does not properly apply, and neither is it illegal what Israel is proposing and contemplating, and the discussions on those proposals will lead to something solid, one hopes, in the course of next month.
Okay, let me leap in there.
Of course.
So Elizabeth has asked a question, and she's made reference to what you have just talked about extending civilian law. But what she's saying is, and I think there's some, and she has referred to Ruti Possedetis juris. What she has asked, and I think it's a fair question, is why impose civilian law now, as against many years ago? Or is it any more legitimate because the Trump administration seems to accept the legal principle? Is this actually not? Is it more expediency than it is principle, do you think?
Well, there have been calls within Israel for moves of this nature for a substantial amount of time. So it's not a new idea. It is taking on traction now in the context of a supportive American administration. But let's be clear about what it is, practically speaking, that Israel is suggesting that it does. It's a change to the temporary administration that Israel established in 1967. So that temporary administration has been in effect now for 53 years. And the reason the administration Israel established in the West Bank in 1967 was temporary is because it was anticipated, it was hoped by Israel, that a negotiated peace settlement at the time with Jordan could be reached, could be swiftly reached, and that would doubtless entail changes to sovereignty or negotiated changes to borders. And on that basis, that temporary framework was introduced. 53 years later, now in Israel, there is a majority, according to many polls, that are taking the position it's entirely unreasonable to expect Israel to maintain a situation of limbo for 53 years. It's a situation where Knesset legislation does not properly apply to these areas. So there is a confusing, desperately confusing patchwork of law that applies in areas in the West Bank. There's leftover Ottoman law, British Mandate law, there's some Jordanian law, and often a great deal of confusion at how these regulate 21st century issues. There's a total absence of environmental legislation and other provisions which benefit the rest of the country where civilian law is applied in full. So the proposal of applying civilian law in these areas brings with it significant benefits to the local population. And this links a little bit to the issues that the ambassador was discussing earlier, because that brings with it benefits to both Jewish and Arab residents of these areas. It's
so
not...
I'm going to interrupt you again, if I may.
Yeah.
Which leads me back to, you made reference to what the ambassador was talking about. And I referred him to territories or countries which were split up. So for example, East and West Pakistan, for example. In your experience, is there an example, historical example, maybe this in this century, where you have been able to have a country which continues to exist even though bits of it, parts of the territory, are not, I think the word's contiguous, it's not all joined up?
Well, I'll give you the example of Israel, and this goes back to the principle of Ruti Possedetis juris and the way that it applies. The International Court of Justice in the Burkina Faso Mali case goes into the principle in detail. It's a case coming from the 80s, where it talks about how this principle has come about and how it's established itself as a matter of customary international law, and it makes it clear that the principle applies to territory even when it's held by another state. So the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, even though they were held, occupied by Jordan and Egypt respectively between 1948 and 1967, under customary international law, Israel would maintain underlying sovereignty to that. And so when it recovered that territory, and some, of course, the entire of the Sinai was returned to Egypt as part of a peace agreement, that was the sort of proposal I'd imagine that the Israeli government at the time was anticipating reaching with Jordan also. But of course, that hasn't been the story.
But wasn't
just to finish on the point that you raised, the difference, of course, with India-Pakistan is that that was subject to a partition agreement. And the partition proposal that was voted on by the United Nations in 1947 was flatly rejected, not just by the local Arab population, but by all of Israel's neighbors, which instead took the opportunity to launch a war of annihilation against it.
Actually, could I just stop? I will stop you there. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the United Nations proposal in 1947 envisaged that which I've just mentioned, which is different territories in different places not quite joined up. Is that right?
One of the key criticisms of the proposal is that you had a sort of patchwork. It was again worked out on the basis of demographics, but it left Israel with indefensible borders.
Well, please.
Yeah, of course. It just occurred to me that it's worth pursuing this point just a little bit further, because there's another massive misconception here, which is that ordinary Palestinian Arabs living in the area impacted will necessarily oppose the proposals. And in fact, Zvi Kelly, the head of the Arab desk at the Israeli news channel 10, did a very interesting set of interviews earlier this week, where he went to the West Bank, to potentially affected areas, and interviewed ordinary Palestinians on the street, protecting their identities. And they told a very different story to the one which is often bandied about in international conversations about this move, because ordinary Arabs living in these areas, depending on what proposal is finally implemented, stand to gain substantively in terms of access to healthcare, access to the welfare system, social security benefits, the right to vote in municipal elections, all of those rights which attach to residency that the ambassador highlighted, including, of course, the possibility of acquiring Israeli citizenship, and then all of the rights and benefits that attach to being a citizen of the only democracy in the Middle East. And he's absolutely right that that is why we've seen in the past, it's not just Poles, but Arabs, Palestinians living in areas slated for full Israeli civil administration in the past have moved with their feet into areas designated for full administration. A few years ago, it was with respect to a few suburbs in Jerusalem, hoping to come under Israeli jurisdiction, hoping to gain residency and all of the benefits that apply to that. And so just being exposed to the arguments, especially in the community here over the last few weeks, I think it's an important point to highlight, especially if we're here, which I believe we all are, to promote Palestinian rights as much as Israeli rights. It's an enormously important misrepresentation to challenge, especially if we're looking to the betterment in the future of all people that are living in the area. And it also links to the practical implications of this. And this goes to an answer to Jacqueline's earlier question, an additional answer, if you will. It's basically the case that none of what Israel is contemplating prejudices what any final settlement will look like. Any proposals around a two-state solution have envisaged Israeli sovereign territory being transferred via land swaps, and most recently the Trump initiative that you were discussing sees significant chunks of the Negev, undisputed Israeli sovereign territory, being transferred in that fashion. So Israel's been expected to negotiate over territory to which its law has applied in full in the past. It's anticipated that it will do so in the future. And it's a complete misnomer, therefore, that the proposal is some impasse to a negotiated solution if the Palestinian leadership come to the table.
So from a legal technical perspective then, subject to negotiation, does this vision for peace envisage that there will in fact be two states?
The Trump vision?
Yes.
It does, yes. That's the driving force behind it. Now, I think perhaps there are those in the audience who will say that one needs, in order to embrace the prospect of a two-state solution with a keen eye to how things have developed over the last couple of decades, one needs to have a great sense of optimism, or even a healthy dose of naivete. But importantly, and I believe the ambassador stressed this earlier, the Trump proposal is a proposed framework for negotiation. It is not a fait accompli. It is an invitation to come to the negotiation table. And I think that's a key part of the reason that you saw so much positivity towards it from Israel's Arab neighbors. The ambassador mentioned that 3 Arab states had attended the unveiling. That was Oman, the UAE, and Bahrain. And that ties in with the astonishing development in Israel's diplomatic relations with its Arab neighbors. No one would have thought a decade ago that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain would be enjoying the sort of blossoming, I say that advisedly, but I only see it hopefully going in one direction, but the blossoming diplomatic relationship that they have with Israel currently. Now, there are wider trends at play, notably Iran, that are undoubtedly impacting that relationship. But to the extent that Israel can continue to build on those, that is a positive thing. And I'm sure those countries will continue to support the sorts of initiatives put forward by the American administration, if only Abu Mazen or whoever succeeds him would come to the negotiation table.
Going back to this idea of enclaves, is the idea that there would be, if you're going to have a extension of civilian law over, say, for example, the Jordan Valley, and they're going to be enclaves of Palestinian population within that, what's that? There's calls that is somehow creating an apartheid state. Is that again a misnomer? Is that not understanding what the plan proposes?
Well, the plan doesn't propose anything yet. And I think this is the key difficulty that we find ourselves in when we're trying to talk specifics here, because no proposal has yet been put forward. The government is slated to start discussing this, the cabinet, from the 1st of July, so next month. But it's an interesting issue that the claim of apartheid is being deployed here, because it's topsy-turvy, if you ask me. What Israel did, as far as the administration of the territory, the temporary administration of the territory is concerned, is it applied aspects of the 4th Geneva Convention, so parts of the framework of the law of occupation. And that mandates military courts being set up to handle issues with respect to the local population that is not a citizen. So the non-citizens of Israel. And that is where you do get a differentiation between Israeli citizens living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and Arab inhabitants, because the international law that Israel has applied as a framework here says that the local Arab inhabitants can only be tried in military courts. Now, there is a small population that is affected by this, because of course, for everyday matters, the vast majority of Palestinian Arabs live in Area A and are fully under the security and civil control of the Palestinian Authority. That is the authority they are meant to be voting for on a regular basis, but unfortunately the elections dried up, and Mahmoud Abbas doesn't seem prepared to leave 4 terms after he was meant to. But that issue aside, what these proposals do, at least for the residents of the area that is affected by it, is level the playing field. Because if Israel is applying its law in full, it is Israeli civil courts that will be addressing any civil or criminal matters that arise, and that will apply to the residents of this area. There will no longer be that distinction. So it's another instance really of Israel being damned if it does and damned if it doesn't, or at least any measure that Israel's taking is being twisted and misrepresented in the international discourse.
Natasha, that has been really helpful. I mean, I like the idea of it being the wrong way around. I like the idea of people jumping the gun in terms of believing what's going on, and it's very helpful to think about how this is more particularly this business of ut possidetis juris seems to be a fundamental issue that so many people are very anxious to avoid. And I think often, speaking as a lawyer, I find that a lot. When someone comes along and I say to them, well, what's your position on this? They say it's all not fair. And I say, well, that might be the case, but what's your legal proposition? And they don't have one. And I think that's what we're faced with here. That you've explained very neatly what the legal reality is. And I think that lots of people are just not very keen on accepting that.
Robert, if I can leave you with a final thought on this, of course, everything that I have said doesn't stop international organisations and governments around the world, and one of the questions alluded to the British Prime Minister, it doesn't stop any of them from indulging in the misrepresentation that we've been discussing, and even eminent law professors are joining the herd mentality of everybody says. But I would just stress that everybody says isn't international law. Everybody says is how you run a lynch, not a legal system. And I appreciate that it is difficult to push back against this tsunami of slander. Even supporters of Israel, perhaps seeking to find the path of least resistance, can feel that difficulty. But if that position is at the expense of the truth and the justice of the situation and the just treatment of Israel in the community of nations, then I think it's the same mistake that we have been making every time Israel is discriminated against in the world, every time Israel's rights are violated, and every time Israel is smeared and people look the other way.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Nigel.
Hi, good evening. I'm very grateful to Natasha. Unlike Natasha and you, Robert, I've not got a legal background and I am a layperson, but I think it's very, very useful for Natasha to confirm the legal status so that people like me can actually go out and properly discuss the situation. And again, I'd like to thank Natasha because she's firmly confirmed that anyone is entitled to an opinion, but not anyone is entitled to their own facts. And I think Natasha has put the facts very, very clearly for people like me to go out back into the community and very forcibly argue the case that nothing that Israel is doing contravenes international law, and it's never been so proven. So Natasha, thank you very much indeed for finding the time to address us this evening. It's been absolutely amazing listening to you. Thank you very much indeed.
It's been my pleasure to be with you.